A millionaire with just 3 months to live surprises everyone by taking in 5 homeless boys. But what happens next will shock you and warm your heart. Don't miss this powerful story that will keep you watching until the very end. Dear friend, what you're about to experience is not just a story. It's a deeply human journey about loss resilience and the quiet, unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. If this is your first time here, I invite you to drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing your voice. And if you're someone who believes in second chances, in the hidden strength of ordinary people, and in stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon. We share moments that matter. Thank you for being part of this one. Now, let's begin. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have everything yet be emptier than anyone you know? Charles Bennett, a man whose name once appeared on the covers of Fortune and Forbes, had spent his life building an empire that sprawled across the skyline of Chicago. But on a bitterly cold December evening, as Christmas lights blinked across West Loop's luxury condos, Charles found himself alone in his penthouse, staring into the darkness of his lavish but silent home. The phone call that afternoon had shattered him beyond measure stage phi pancreatic cancer, 3 months left at best. There were no children's footsteps echoing through his halls, no laughter to soften the sterile hum of his modern mansion, and not a single soul waiting for him when the last day arrived. His late wife, whom he had loved beyond words, had died years earlier of a sudden aneurysm, and he had never found the courage to love or live fully again. Work was his only refuge, but now even that seemed hollow. That night, unable to sleep, he told his driver to take him on a ride through Chicago's Lower Wacker Drive, a place he remembered from his own painful youth. As the car rolled through patches of snow and shadow, Charles peered out and saw 5 small forms huddled under an overpass, their thin blankets barely holding off the December wind. The driver glanced nervously at Charles in the rearview mirror as he whispered, "Sir, it's not safe down here." But something inside Charles snapped. A lifetime of repressed pain, the sudden knowledge that his time was slipping away, and the memory of his own nights sleeping on park benches as a runaway, all collided in that moment. He opened the door before the limo had come to a full stop. The cold slapped him like a punishment, but he kept walking. Each step echoed with memories of a boy who had once sworn he'd never be powerless again. He approached the group, slowly raising his hands to show he meant no harm. 5 boys stared at him, their eyes wide with suspicion and something else, the fierce determination of children who had survived too much. The oldest, Isaiah, stepped forward, his chin lifted defiantly. "We don't want your money," he said before Charles could even speak. His voice was rough but steady. Charles felt a lump form in his throat. He had rehearsed a dozen lines in his head, but now, standing before them, all he could manage was the truth. "I don't want anything from you," he rasped, his voice breaking under the weight of years of loneliness. "I just want you to have a warm place tonight." There was a stunned silence. One of the twins, Micah or Miles Charles, couldn't yet tell them apart, muttered something about tricks and cops. Little Noah, just 7, looked up at Charles with impossibly wide eyes and asked, "Why would a rich man care if we freeze?" The innocence in that question hit Charles harder than his cancer diagnosis. His answer came from a place he hadn't touched in decades. "Because once I was just like you." A gust of wind howled through the underpass. Snowflakes spiraled between them as the boys exchanged uncertain glances. Isaiah's jaw clenched, his eyes darting from Charles to the limo idling on the street. Finally, he nodded once. "One night. We stay together, we leave if we want." Charles almost smiled. He recognized that tone. It was the sound of a child forced to become an adult too soon. 20 minutes later, the boys entered his penthouse, stepping into a world of marble floors, soaring ceilings, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the frozen city. They moved as a unit, staying close, scanning every corner. Charles watched them with an ache he couldn't explain. This was the first time in years that his home felt alive. He showed them where the kitchen was stocked with food, pointed out the bathrooms, and offered fresh clothes. As he turned to retreat to his study, Noah's small voice stopped him again. "Are you going to die soon?" The question cut through the polished calm Charles usually projected like a blade. He turned slowly, his eyes glistening. "Yes," he answered softly. "That's what they tell me." Noah nodded gravely, as if he understood mortality better than a 7-year-old should. "Then we'll stay," the boy whispered. Tears stung Charles's eyes. He had no idea why those words meant so much, but they did. In that moment, Charles realized the full horror of what his life had become. All the money, power, and prestige had bought him nothing of true value. Not family, not love, not hope. He thought of his grand boardroom with its gleaming conference table, the place he once felt invincible. It suddenly seemed pathetic compared to this fragile alliance forming between a dying man and 5 children who had every reason to hate the world. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. He wandered the halls of his own home, listening to the muffled sounds of children breathing the rustle of blankets, the soft whispers they shared when they thought he wasn't listening. Each sound was a symphony of life that filled the void he'd carried for decades. He leaned against the doorframe of his study and let the tears fall. Regret crashed over him in waves, the missed opportunities to have a family, the years wasted chasing power, the moments he would never get back. But alongside the regret was something else, something that surprised him, the faintest spark of peace. He thought of the boys in the guest rooms, safe and warm, and he realized for the first time since his wife's death he wasn't alone anymore. He knew the world would think he'd lost his mind. They would laugh, call him a fool, speculate he was trying to buy redemption. But in his heart, Charles understood this decision was the first honest thing he'd done in years. The lesson was painfully simple, yet so easy to forget. Life's true worth is measured not in what you own, but in the people you care for. As dawn began to light up the icy streets of Chicago, Charles knew everything had changed. He might still die in 3 months, but he was determined those months would mean something. And as he stood in the window watching the city come to life, he could almost hear the beginning of a new story unfolding. A story he would no longer face alone. And so, with his heart full of fear, but also fragile hope, Charles prepared to face the days ahead, unaware that the challenges waiting for him would test the very limits of love, loyalty, and courage. The first night in Charles Bennett's penthouse unfolded like an uneasy truce between 2 worlds that should never have collided. While the city outside slept beneath a blanket of fresh snow, the air inside the towering glass and steel sanctuary was tense with unspoken fears. The 5 boys moved in a tight formation through the halls, their eyes darting from the glittering chandeliers to the strange art on the walls. Charles watched them from a distance, his heart tight with worry. He realized then that bringing these boys home was only the first step. Earning their trust would be far harder. As they sat around the massive dining table for the first time, the mood was awkward. Charles served them warm bowls of soup himself, wanting to show he wasn't above the simplest acts of care. But every time he placed a bowl in front of a child, they flinched, as if expecting a blow. Isaiah, always the protector, kept his eyes locked on Charles, his spoon untouched. Micah and Miles took turns pretending to eat while scanning exits and corners, clearly planning escape routes. Caleb barely looked up, his small hands clutching the spoon but not lifting it. Noah, however, kept staring at Charles with curiosity that bordered on painful honesty. "You live here all alone. Noah finally asked, his voice piercing the strained silence. Charles forced a smile that felt like it cracked his face. "Yes, I do," he replied quietly. The words tasted bitter. Isaiah's voice cut through the fragile peace like a knife. Why would someone with a place like this have no one? Charles was stunned by the question's bluntness and the truth it exposed. His gaze dropped to the untouched soup in front of him. "Because I thought building this would be enough." He confessed, his voice barely a whisper. The boys shifted uncomfortably. Their lives had been marked by betrayal and empty promises. To them, words were weapons or bait, never comfort. Charles sensed this and tried to bridge the gulf between them with a story of his own. He told them about the nights he spent alone in a foster home, the times he'd stolen stale bread just to quiet his hunger, the way he'd lied to other kids so they wouldn't know how scared he was. As he spoke, he saw something change in Isaiah's eyes, a flicker of recognition. It was the first crack in the wall the boy had built around himself. Later, Charles showed them their rooms. He'd had his housekeeper set up 5 guest bedrooms with new bedding and pajamas. But when he checked on them an hour later, he found all 5 boys huddled together in one room, blankets pulled tight around them like armor. The sight broke him. He remembered how as a child he'd longed for someone to sit with him until he fell asleep. Overwhelmed, he sank into a chair in the hall outside their door, listening to them whisper. Noah's small voice carried through the crack. "Do you think he'll send us away tomorrow?" Isaiah answered, his voice hard but low. "We stay alert. If he tries anything, we leave." Charles felt his chest constrict. The boys were here, but their hearts were still on the streets. He knew it would take more than warm beds and hot food to make them believe they were safe. As he sat alone, he resolved not to retreat to the comfortable distance he'd always kept from people. If he wanted these boys to trust him, he had to trust them first. The next morning, Charles woke early, his restless mind unable to find peace. He decided to make breakfast himself, an act that felt strangely foreign for a man who had lived with chefs and staff most of his adult life. He burned the first batch of pancakes, filling the kitchen with smoke. As he waved a towel at the shrieking alarm, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he found Caleb peeking in. The boy's eyes widened at the mess. Charles braced for ridicule, but instead, Caleb burst into giggles. The sound was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The laughter drew the other boys who trickled into the kitchen, their defenses lowered by the absurdity of the situation. Soon, Micah and Miles were helping Charles mix batter, arguing over the right amount of milk. Isaiah hovered by the door, still cautious, while Noah climbed onto a stool to stir. The kitchen, usually silent and sterile, buzzed with life. Charles caught Isaiah's eye and offered him a spatula. After a long pause, the boy stepped forward and took it. That simple gesture felt like a small miracle. As they ate their lumpy, misshapen pancakes together, something shifted. Isaiah told Charles about the nights he'd spent keeping watch over the others in abandoned buildings. Micah and Miles shared how they had taught themselves to fix broken phones they scavenged from the trash. Caleb quietly confessed he used to draw pictures in chalk on sidewalks, hoping someone would notice him. And Noah, in a voice as soft as snowfall, told Charles he believed the stars could hear wishes. Each story deepened the fragile connection forming between them. For the first time, Charles saw not just scared, hardened kids, but brilliant, resilient souls who deserved so much more than the world had given them. He felt tears prick his eyes as he realized these boys were teaching him how to live again. The lesson that morning was as clear as the pale winter light streaming through the kitchen windows. Trust is built not by grand gestures but by small moments of honesty and shared vulnerability. and as Charles watched the boys laugh over syrup-covered pancakes, he dared to hope that they could find a way forward together. He knew challenges were waiting. The world outside would not understand or accept a dying tycoon and 5 boys from the streets forming an unlikely family. There would be whispers, skepticism, and threats he couldn't yet foresee. But for now, in this moment of warmth and tentative trust, Charles felt more alive than he had in decades, and deep in his heart he sensed that their greatest tests and their greatest triumphs were yet to come. Victor Langford had always been a man who thrived on the weaknesses of others. The news of Charles Bennett's terminal diagnosis was the perfect crack in an empire Victor had spent years trying to conquer. He smelled blood in the water and wasted no time gathering his allies' shadowy figures in expensive suits, plotting over scotch in dimly lit boardrooms. He mocked Charles' decision to bring 5 homeless boys into his life, spinning the story to investors as proof that Charles had lost his mind. In Victor's world, compassion was weakness, and he intended to exploit it. Meanwhile, Charles was oblivious to the growing storm outside his penthouse. He was focused on small victories, teaching the boys to tie ties, reading bedtime stories, and sitting beside them as they nervously dipped their toes into the new world he offered. But each morning brought more unsettling signs. His board members canceled meetings without explanation. Journalists camped outside his building, snapping photos of the boys through tinted SUV windows. A worried Dr. Emily Carter visited him after seeing news stories suggesting Charles was unfit to care for children, warning him that social services might intervene. The boys sensed something was wrong before Charles said a word. Isaiah noticed the security guards whispering. Micah and Miles found new spyware attempts on the penthouse's Wi-Fi networks. Caleb caught glimpses of unmarked vans parked across the street, their windows blacked out. Late one night, Charles woke to find Noah curled up in his study chair, wide awake. "Why aren't you sleeping?" Charles asked, his voice low. Noah answered with eyes wise beyond his years. "Because you're scared. If you're scared, we should be too." That simple statement cut through Charles like a knife. He realized he couldn't hide the truth from them. They had lived too long in a world where safety could vanish overnight. The next morning, he gathered the boys around the kitchen table. He explained who Victor Langford was, what he wanted, and how people like Victor believed the boys were nothing but disposable pawns. He expected them to look terrified. But to his surprise, their eyes hardened with resolve. Isaiah was the first to speak. "If he's coming for us, we should know how to fight." Then Micah and Miles spoke up, offering to secure the penthouse's digital systems. The twins revealed they had spent years teaching themselves to hack old phones and computers they found in the trash skills that had once helped them survive, but now offered a way to protect their new family. Charles was stunned as he watched the boys hook up laptops, install encryption programs, and set up surveillance feeds that outclassed anything he had paid security firms to build. Caleb showed Charles a notebook filled with sketches of Face's vehicles and license plates he'd memorized from the street below, every van, every unfamiliar face. His sharp eye for detail was a gift Charles realized he had underestimated. Then there was Noah, who began sitting quietly with Charles in meetings, picking up on the smallest changes in tone or body language, offering insights no adult noticed. "He's lying," Noah whispered during a call with a board member one afternoon. And he was right. The man resigned 2 days later, after a secret recording of him conspiring with Victor leaked online. As the days passed, the boys' talents revealed themselves like hidden jewels. Charles marveled at how life on the streets had forged them into resourceful, brilliant survivors. It made him furious to think of the world that had discarded them and determined to prove Victor wrong. One night, he found himself sitting on the floor of his study with the boys sprawled around him, laptops open and papers scattered. "I can't believe you know how to do all this," he told them honestly. Isaiah looked up from his notes with a sad smile. We had to. On the street, knowing things keeps you alive." Charles' eyes filled with tears. The weight of their words settled on him like lead. He realized that while he had been trying to teach them to live in his world, they were showing him how to survive in theirs. He told them the truth of his illness, the odds stacked against him, and his fear of leaving them alone. They didn't flinch or shy away. Instead, Isaiah placed a hand on his shoulder and said with quiet certainty, "Then we'll make sure you're not alone." The penthouse transformed into a war room. Charts of Victor's shell companies covered the walls. Caleb's sketches became a map of every threat. The twins ran simulations to predict Victor's next moves. They uncovered evidence of his bribery, found hidden accounts, and even identified a corrupt social worker on his payroll who was preparing a case to remove the boys. Charles and the children strategized together, their bond deepening with every late-night planning session. Each moment was bittersweet, a reminder of the precious time slipping through Charles' hands. One evening, Dr. Emily Carter stopped by unannounced. She found Charles and the boys poring over documents in the dining room. She looked at Charles with disbelief and something like admiration. "They're extraordinary," she murmured. Charles nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "They are the best thing that ever happened to me." Emily, moved by the scene, vowed to help him fight, offering her connections to the media and child welfare advocates to keep the boys safe. That night, after the boys had drifted off to sleep on couches and beanbags in his study, Charles sat alone in the glow of the city lights. He thought of the men who would laugh at him for letting these children into his heart. He thought of Victor and the vultures circling his company. But more than anything, he thought of the boys themselves. 5 extraordinary children who had already endured more pain than he could imagine, yet still chose to stand by him. He understood now that love was not a weakness. It was the only thing that gave life meaning. He knew the real battle was just beginning. The snow was falling heavily the night everything changed. Charles Bennett had just finished reviewing security reports with Isaiah and the twins when his phone rang with a call from his driver. Voice trembling, the boys were gone. They had left the penthouse for a short walk with the security detail Charles trusted, but the guards had been overpowered, and the boys were gone without a trace. In that instant, Charles' world imploded. His hands shook as he tried calling each of the boys' cell phones, only to hear them ring unanswered from the far end of the apartment where they'd been left behind like trophies. Charles fell to his knees in the middle of his vast living room, the sound of the city below muted by his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His mind reeled with visions of the boys terrified and alone, of Victor Langford's smug face as he held the lives of these children like cards to be played. Desperation clawed at his chest until he couldn't breathe. Dr. Emily Carter, who had been visiting to drop off new medical supplies, caught him before he collapsed completely. Her voice was firm, eyes fierce. "You can't fall apart now. They need you more than ever." The hours that followed felt like an eternity. Charles worked alongside Emily and the twin security software scanning street cameras across Chicago for any clue. They found a blurry image of a black van speeding away near Navy Pier. Isaiah's drawings, pinned up across the study walls, suddenly served a new purpose, identifying the men Charles once thought were harmless bystanders. Each scribbled face became a lead, each license plate a trail. Emily's medical contacts reached out to off-duty cops who owed her favors, and soon a whisper network of allies formed across the city, all working to find the missing boys. Then came the phone call that nearly shattered Charles Victor himself, his voice cold and calm. "They're safe for now," he drawled. "But unless you sign over every asset, every share, you'll never see them again." Charles's hands clenched until his knuckles went white. The anger that rose inside him was like fire, burning away the helplessness. He had watched his mother lose everything to men like Victor, and he had vowed never to be powerless again. But it wasn't his fortune he cared about. Now it was the boys who had become his heart. Isaiah, ever the protector, had taught the boys what to do if something went wrong. That foresight saved them. Noah, the youngest, left chalk marks on alley walls as they were hustled into the van. Caleb scratched a message into the door panel with a broken key Navy pier. These small acts of courage guided Charles's people directly to their location. As he and Emily arrived at an abandoned warehouse near the frozen lake, Charles's heart nearly stopped at the sight of flashing lights and shouting men. What followed was chaos. Emily, using her credentials, convinced first responders to let them through. Charles rushed into the warehouse, breath steaming in the cold, shouting the boys' names. He found them huddled together behind crates, bruised but alive. The raw relief that coursed through him brought him to his knees again, but this time Isaiah helped him stand. "I told them you'd come," the boy said hoarsely, eyes shining with tears. Charles pulled them all close, burying his face in their hair, promising over and over that he'd never let them go again. The police escorted them back to the penthouse, but the ordeal wasn't over. News vans swarmed the entrance lights, flashing as reporters shouted questions. Victor's allies leaked stories, claiming Charles was unfit, that he had endangered the children with his recklessness. Emily guided the boys inside while Charles stood on the sidewalk staring down the cameras. He raised his voice so the entire city could hear. "I will never give up on these boys," he declared. "They are my family, and I promise you this: I will protect them with every breath I have left." That moment became a turning point. The city that had doubted him saw a man risking everything for children who weren't his by blood but were his by choice. Neighbors, strangers, and even former critics began sending messages of support. Food was delivered to the penthouse. Letters poured in from people who had once been foster kids themselves, telling stories of hope and survival. For the first time, Charles saw proof that love could spread farther than fear, that his fight wasn't just his own anymore. Sitting with the boys that night as they recovered from their ordeal, Charles explained what Victor had tried to do. The boys listened quietly, faces serious. Then Noah climbed into Charles' lap and said, "You don't have to protect us alone. We'll protect you too." The words broke what was left of Charles's defenses. Tears slid down his face as he realized this wasn't just a rescue. It was a bond unbreakable by greed or threats. And as dawn approached, Charles knew they could no longer simply hide from Victor's schemes. They would have to confront him head-on and end the threat once and for all. The morning after the boys were rescued, Charles Bennett woke with a new resolve. He felt weak, his body protesting every movement, but his heart burned with a sense of purpose stronger than anything he had known. For too long he had accepted the idea that he was dying, that the best he could do was prepare his affairs before slipping quietly away. But seeing the boys huddled together in that warehouse had changed him. He realized he wasn't afraid of death anymore. He was terrified of leaving them alone in a world that had already hurt them so deeply. He called a meeting in his study, gathering the boys and Dr. Emily Carter around the fireplace as snow continued to fall outside. Charles spoke with quiet conviction, outlining his plan. They would launch the Bennett Sanctuary Initiative, a program dedicated to rescuing homeless and at-risk youth across Chicago, offering shelter, education, and a chance to find family. Isaiah looked skeptical at first, but as Charles explained how the boys' own experiences would shape the program, his eyes began to glow with belief. "You mean we'll help kids like us?" Micah asked, his voice cracking. Charles nodded. "No one knows what they need better than you do." The boys threw themselves into the project with a passion that stunned even Charles. Caleb designed logos and posters with sketches that captured hope and resilience. Micah and Miles built a secure website to accept donations and coordinate outreach. Isaiah organized meetings with community leaders, his quiet strength commanding respect from adults twice his age. Noah sat with Charles during every planning session, offering surprising insights on how to make the sanctuary feel welcoming. Each boy found a place where his talents shone, and for the first time they began to imagine a future beyond survival. As word spread, the city's response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from people who had seen the news coverage of the kidnapping and rescue. Volunteers offered their time and skills. Even former critics of Charles reached out with apologies and pledges of support. One afternoon, a woman knocked on the penthouse door, tears streaming down her face as she handed Charles a check. "I was in foster care too," she said. "I wish someone had done this when I was a child." Charles accepted it with gratitude, his voice thick with emotion. The greatest test came when Victor Langford, cornered and desperate, tried one last time to destroy them. He scheduled a press conference at City Hall, planning to accuse Charles of exploiting the boys to salvage his legacy. But Charles and the boys arrived first, standing side by side as cameras flashed. Charles stepped up to the podium and spoke with unwavering sincerity. He told the world about his diagnosis, his mistakes, and how 5 boys had given him a reason to fight for something greater than himself. Then he stepped back and let Isaiah speak. Isaiah's voice was clear and strong as he described their lives before Charles found them, the hunger, the fear, and the nights wondering if they'd live to see morning. He told the crowd how Charles had never treated them like charity cases, but as sons with futures worth believing in. As he spoke, Micah and Miles shared the screen behind them with live data showing the sanctuary's early successes: kids off the streets, reunified families, school enrollments rising. Caleb's art scrolled across the monitor's drawings of children smiling beneath the words, "Every child deserves a chance." Victor's accusations crumbled in the face of such raw honesty. When he tried to speak, reporters turned their backs. Within days, Victor was under investigation for fraud and child endangerment, his empire unraveling as quickly as it had grown. Charles and the boys had not just defended themselves, they had exposed a rot in the system and offered a vision of what could replace it. As the Bennett sanctuary officially opened its doors, the first families arrived to find warm beds, stocked kitchens, and mentors ready to guide them. Charles, frail but standing tall, greeted each child personally. Dr. Emily oversaw medical checkups, her eyes shining with pride as she watched the boys helping younger kids settle in. That evening, as the sun set over Chicago, Charles gathered his 5 sons on the roof of the sanctuary's new headquarters. The city lights stretched out before them like stars fallen to earth. "I once thought my money was my greatest achievement," he told them softly, his voice thick with feeling. "But you've taught me the only legacy worth leaving is the lives you touch." Tears glistened in the boys' eyes as they crowded around him. Noah reached for his hand. "We're your legacy," he whispered, his small voice breaking. That night they shared a quiet dinner at the sanctuary, laughter mixing with the hum of children's voices drifting from the halls. For Charles, every moment was a gift, every smile proof that love could heal wounds even deeper than his own. And as he lay down to sleep in a modest room he had chosen at the sanctuary instead of his penthouse, he felt peace like he had never known. He had found redemption not in power or wealth, but in family, and in the hope he could leave a world a little kinder than the one he was born into. Charles Bennett began his final chapter believing he was destined to die alone, a billionaire, with 3 months left, and nothing but regret echoing through the marble halls of his penthouse. But a chance encounter with 5 homeless boys on a freezing Chicago night shattered the walls he'd built around his heart. From that moment, everything changed. He opened his home to Isaiah, Micah, Miles, Caleb, and Noah, discovering not only their fierce resilience, but also the incredible talents forged by lives spent surviving the streets. Together, they exposed the ruthless schemes of Victor Langford, outmaneuvered betrayal, and turned what began as a desperate rescue into a powerful mission to save countless others. Through small tender moments, burnt pancakes in the kitchen whispered stories of fear and hope, and promises exchanged in dark hours, Charles and the boys built an unbreakable bond. They transformed from strangers united by misfortune into a true family bound by love stronger than blood. In his final days, Charles found purpose far beyond the cold logic of profit and power. He learned that redemption is always possible and legacy is measured not in dollars, but in the lives we touch and uplift. The moral of this story is one of compassion and patience. Sometimes the greatest change begins when we open our hearts especially to those society overlooks. Charles' willingness to let go of his pride, listen to the pain of others, and stand beside them in their darkest moments allowed him to find peace and leave a mark deeper than any business deal ever could. This tale reminds us to seek opportunities to be kind, even when it's inconvenient to understand that healing ourselves often starts with helping others, and to remember that everyone, no matter how broken they seem, carries a spark worth saving. In our own lives, practicing empathy and giving second chances can build bridges that change not just our world, but the world of those around us. If this story moved you even a little, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment below. Your support means the world to us and gives us the motivation to keep bringing you powerful, heartfelt stories that inspire and remind us all of what truly matters. Thank you so much for watching, and we can't wait to share more incredible stories with you soon.